Okay, so in this video, we're going to start our first big topic of time period 2 in Euro. So time period 2 takes us from 1648, the Peace of Westphalia and the end of the 30 Years' War, to 1815, which is the end of the Napoleonic Wars. So again, this period is kind of bookended by the end of conflicts, the end of the 30 Years' War and the end of the Napoleonic Wars. We'll see why these wars are different during this time period, but essentially, this is the end of religious wars, and these are going to be the ends of the revolutionary wars of Europe. And then the wars after this will take on a more nationalistic or populist tone, but we'll worry about all of that stuff when we get to time period 3. So the first big topic of time period 2 that we're going to do is the English Civil War. Now, this is a nice segue between time periods 1 and time periods 2. So this whole thing is going to take us kind of from the end of time period 1 well into time period 2. So this story really picks up in 1625, although we'll start a little bit before that to kind of hit the ground running. And it's going to keep going until, make sure I have the date down for this. Well, we'll say 1707. So the English Civil War is going to start here, and it's pretty much going to end right there. You can make an argument that this is the end date of everything, although the real fighting really ends a few years before that. So let's pick up where we left off. So this conflict starts with Elizabeth's death. So Elizabeth dies in 1603. And part of her whole mystique was that she did not get married and had no children. So there were no heirs. So when she died, they had to go down the line of succession to find the next person who had claim to the English throne. And through some back channels, they had kind of been talking to this person as Elizabeth was dying to make sure that he was ready for this. And the person that becomes king after Elizabeth is James VI of Scotland, who we will refer to as James I of England. He has both titles, so you might see him referred to as James VI and James I. So you might see him referred to that way because he had both titles, and he is the King of Scotland and the King of England at the same time, but they are not one country yet. He is the king of two separate countries, and that's going to make a difference when we move forward through this. So remember, Scotland and England are very different places. He just happens to be the king of both of them. And for those of you that are curious, James is Elizabeth's second cousin once removed. He was her closest living relative. Now, James, like Elizabeth, had to walk a fine religious line as the king of both of these countries. He had a different issue than Elizabeth did. So, like Elizabeth, he had this very difficult religious path he had to walk to keep both the Scots and the English happy. His problem, though, was different than Elizabeth's. England was now pretty thoroughly Anglican. Elizabeth had managed to keep England Anglican, and pretty much everybody in England now follows the Anglican Church. The Scots, on the other hand, are Presbyterian. In other words, they're Calvinists. So James had to kind of walk this fine line to keep everybody relatively happy. So he was pretty much non-committal in terms of religion. He said the right things to the Anglicans, and he said the right things to the Presbyterians. He was also very studious to keep out of religious wars in Europe. So he stayed out of the 30 Years' War. So if you wonder why England wasn't involved in the 30 Years' War, that's why. James purposefully kept England out of this war so as not to upset this balance he had between his two kingdoms. In the midst of all of this, there are these really, really hardcore Calvinists in England that we know better as the Puritans. That was not their name for themselves. This was a derisive nickname given to them. But these Puritans wanted to get rid of all Catholic stuff remaining in the church. Remaining in, well, I guess we'll just say in England. We want to get rid of all the Catholic stuff. That's why they are called Puritans. They wanted to purify the religion of Catholic stuff. Another problem for James, as if he doesn't have enough problems with all of these religious issues, another problem for James was in the different political systems of his two kingdoms. Scotland had a strong king and a weak parliament. Pretty much the king did whatever he wanted in Scotland. England, as we noted in the Elizabeth DBQ we did, England had a more mixed system where the monarch and the parliament had specific rules. They had specific rules that they had to follow, and that goes way back to the Magna Carta in 1215. So the Magna Carta, we don't need to go into what the Magna Carta said, but basically what the Magna Carta set in motion was this system where the monarch has limitations and Parliament has specific rules that it has to follow. So it's setting a precedent that the king is not limitless. Parliament has some rules that they can impose on the monarch. So Scotland basically allows the king to do whatever he wants. England, the king can do a lot of what he wants, but there are certain things that Parliament has control over, and the king has to accept those limitations. This, for James, was a bit of a culture shock. He understood that there were rules on the king in England that he didn't have to follow in Scotland, but in practice, that was a lot harder to do. Most of these rules, and I bring this up because we're going to have to deal with this a lot coming up here in a second. Most of these rules for the monarch is that Parliament gets a say in all taxes. Parliament gets to approve any and all new taxes. The fact that this is coming up now is also going to be foreshadowing here a little bit one of the causes of the American Revolution, because the Americans say that because Parliament gets a say in all the taxes, the American colonists not having a say in the British Parliament means that the taxes don't apply to them. So that's where the whole no taxation without representation comes from. But again, we're getting ahead of ourselves. So this issue is going to be at the core of the English Civil War. One more point that we should probably make before leaving James and talking about his son Charles is that, as we've seen in France, a lot of the English nobility become Calvinists. And a lot of these Calvinists are going to be these hardcore Puritans. So the people in Parliament, a lot of them are Calvinists, and a lot of the Calvinists are Puritans. So that's another wrinkle in here, is that not only does James have to deal with the Anglicans and the Calvinists in England and Scotland, he also has to deal with this very small but very rich and vocal Calvinist minority in his parliament. Okay, I know that was a lot of stuff. You may need to replay some of that to get all of it. Hopefully that is enough background, because now we're going to jump into the actual conflict. So James manages to walk this tightrope until his death in 1625. So James dies in 1625, and his son, Charles, becomes king of both England and Scotland. So we're going to refer to him as Charles the First. I believe he's also Charles the Sixth of Scotland, but we're only going to call him Charles the First because this is the English Civil War. So Charles was much more, I guess we can say, antagonistic than his dad. James really did his best to try to keep everybody content. Nobody was especially happy. He wasn't especially on anybody's side, but he did enough to keep everybody happy. Charles, on the other hand, seemed to pick on people. He seemed to make these matters worse. So things were kind of tense under James, but James managed to keep a lid on it. Charles, on the other hand, didn't seem to care about keeping a lid on it. He made things worse. So he was much less tolerant of English customs and tried to force a lot of changes. So one of the very first things that Charles does is he gets married. And he gets married to a French princess who we don't need to bother with her name. But right out of the gate, Charles is pushing everybody's buttons. Because not only did he marry a French princess, he married a Catholic. And we're like, guys, we just finished fighting this whole thing between Catholics and Protestants. Anne Boleyn got her head chopped off. Elizabeth and James both walked this tightrope. And now Charles is over here marrying a Catholic princess. So right from the beginning, Charles is pushing people's buttons. Remember that a lot of people in Parliament are these hardcore Puritans who want to get rid of all of the Catholic stuff in England, and here is Charles bringing more Catholic stuff into England. In response to this, Parliament refuses to give Charles these ceremonial, I guess you could call them tax money. These ceremonial tax monies, the name of which it's called tonnage and poundage. Basically, this is money that is collected to kind of fund the king's expenses. Like this is his salary. This is the money that the king uses for his own personal expenses. And normally, Parliament would give the king tonnage and poundage for life. Basically, they're saying, for the rest of your life, we're going to give you some spending money this money comes from like taxes on imports. It's not a lot of money, but it's what the king uses for his personal expenses. And in response to Charles marrying this French princess, Parliament decides they're going to kind of return the favor. If Charles is going to slap them in the face with a French princess, they're going to slap Charles in the face by not granting him this money to fund his household. So Charles responds by dissolving Parliament. Which is completely his right to do. He's able to do this legally. This is his right as king. And he doesn't want to call a new one. Because he doesn't want to. These guys insulted me. I'm not going to give them the chance to insult me again. So he dissolves Parliament. However, as kings do, he needed some money. And the only way to get this money was to call a new Parliament. So in 1628, he calls a new Parliament. And they kind of bury the hatchet. Charles signs this thing called the Petition of Right, which basically is an acknowledgement of Parliament's role in English politics. So Charles signs a Petition of Right. He says, yes, I understand. You guys have a role to play. I acknowledge it. Here's my signature. In return, Parliament gives Charles some money. I think he gets 3 years of tonnage and poundage, instead of a lifetime of tonnage and poundage. They say, well, we'll give you 3 years. Charles again sees this as a slap in the face, so Charles dissolves Parliament again. So instead of him getting a lifetime of tonnage and poundage, Charles dissolves Parliament again because he sees it again as a slap in the face. Charles does not call another Parliament for 11 years. So from 1628-29 to 1640, this is called the period of personal rule, because Charles is running England all by himself. Now, kind of ironically, this coincides with a long period of peace, because wars are expensive and Charles is broke because Parliament is the one that passes taxes And Charles isn't getting any taxes from a non-existent parliament. So Charles has to be peaceful. In fact, he ends wars with Spain and France because he doesn't have any money. He has to sue for peace. He has to negotiate an end to these conflicts. We don't need to worry about what these wars are. They're related to the 30 Years' War. So this kind of pulls Charles out of England's very limited connection to the 30 Years' War. So England doesn't, or Charles doesn't have the money to fight wars because Parliament won't give him any money to fight any wars. But Charles still needs money, and Parliament won't give it to him. Because they're not there. He won't call them. So Charles gets kind of sneaky about it, and he starts looking through all the law books looking for fees or dues or fines that are paid directly to the king. And he finds a lot of them. But most of them, most weren't enforced for decades or even centuries. Like he finds like ancient laws that are still on the books, and he starts enforcing these laws in order to make money. But these are all rules that nobody has followed for decades or sometimes hundreds of years. So Charles is happy. No one else is. Because Charles is doing everything he can to get around having to work with Parliament. So Charles is fine with this, but he's also making every other part of English society really mad at him. He's making the nobility mad for going around them. He's making the regular people mad because they're having to pay these fees and dues and fines that Charles is collecting. No one is happy except for Charles. So there is a very large number of people that Charles is making an enemy out of. Let me give you one example of this kind of money that he's collecting, and we'll end with this idea. So here is one example of this kind of money that he's collecting. It's called ship money. Here's how ship money is supposed to work. In an emergency, coastal areas can be asked to give money to the government to build ships to defend England. So, for example, the Spanish Armada is coming. We need a bunch of ships guys, we don't have time to pass a law through Parliament. We need to build a bunch of ships right now. Give us some money so we can go defend you from the Spanish. That's how this is supposed to work. Now, here's what Charles did. Charles just declared an emergency. And according to Charles's lawyers, the king is the only one that gets to decide when to call an emergency and what counts as an emergency. No one else gets a say. So Charles just says, it's an emergency, pay me my ship money. So he declared an emergency and made all the counties, all the areas of England pay the money. Because, of course, you could make the argument that it's not just the coastal counties that are in danger to a Spanish invasion. It's all the counties of England, so everybody should pay. Okay, well, that at least kind of sounds fair. So Charles declared a quote-unquote emergency and made all the counties of England pay it, and everybody kind of begrudgingly paid. Everyone paid. I mean, there was no, it was legal. There were no loopholes. Everything was on sound legal footing. There was no reason not to pay the money. So everybody paid. They're like, good one, Charles, you got us. All right, here's your money. The problem is, the next year, Charles did it again. And now everybody is kind of like, okay, this isn't a real emergency. Every year you're asking us for this money. And the more times you ask for it, this starts to sound more and more like a tax that you are collecting without Parliament's consent. So you are making us pay a tax that Parliament has not agreed to. You can call it ship money all you want to, but it's really a tax if you're going to make us do it every year, and that is against the rules. So you can imagine that this is just the kind of opportunity that all of these people that Charles has been making angry for the past, 10 years, this is just the opportunity they're looking for to get Charles to stop acting this way. And so when we pick this up in the next video, we'll see what the repercussions of this ship money scandal turn out to be. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.